global architectural history in today's world might sound completely unproblematic, right? Architectural history, we have buildings, we need architectural history, we know we live in a global world, obviously global architectural history. But actually the idea of global architectural history, which sort of began to take shape in the 70s and the 80s, really is still an emerging question. So I can sort of explain that, up until now, if you wanted to study a building, for example, like the Buddhist temple of Borobudur in Indonesia, you would have looked at Buddhist architecture. You might have looked at architecture of Indonesia. And you might have looked at how it was sited and the beautiful Buddhist frieze that was painted along it and how religion was expressed through this architecture. All of that is perfectly fine. But today we could sort of add many layers to this question. So the building is designed as a series of terraces, each one square, but smaller and smaller to a top terrace. And on the top of the terrace is what's called stupas, which are technically sort of solid buildings. And the center one is solid, but the circumferential ones are actually stone buildings with holes in them, and the Buddha is sitting inside looking out through these holes. Sort of, where's the Buddha? You can sort of see him, but not see him. So the whole building is meant to be a way to experience sort of the nirvana of release from the problem of mass and Buddha's own personal search toward sort of the resolution of his spirit. Now that's one way to look at it. But when you go to the building, you realize that to build this building, the architects took an existent sort of large hilltop and they chopped it down. So they removed tons and tons and tons of material and then built the building over the residual, like a crown on a tooth in a way, right? The building is actually one stone thick. It's solidly stone, right? Because there's actually the bedrock forms sort of the solid interior. And then you ask, well, that's sort of an interesting way to make a building, is to remove the earth and then make the building with the residue. Then you go to Southeast Asia and you discover in Angkor Wat that building 100 years later of exactly the same way, in which they took a mountain, they chopped it down and built a building around the top of it, adding a layer of stones, right? But this is not to a Buddhist deity, not to Buddhism, but to a Hindu deity. So we see how this technology of manipulating the landscape shifts from Buddhism to Hinduism. Right? So obviously the engineers who did Borobudur, when they finished building Borobudur, they had nothing to do. And someone in Angkor Wat in Cambodia said, hey, you can come work for us. And so they go there and they said, okay, by the way, this is not a Buddhist temple, it's a Hindu temple. Oh, it doesn't really matter, we can do the same sort of technology. So if we only look at this as a Buddhist temple, we're missing, in some sense, the transfer of certain types of techniques that go from Buddhism to Hinduism. Now, if I look at Hindu temples, and I read about Hindu temples, they're not going to talk about Buddhist temples. So this is why what I would consider the global helps us get rid of some of these sort of static ideas of how buildings belong in certain categories. But if we look at other ways of understanding how flows and how technologies move, we realize that these categories are sometimes useful, but sometimes not useful. So what we want to do in studying architecture is make sure that we're not always assuming that all the categories we use are the correct ones. And especially if we're dealing with trade and trade routes and changes of power and culture, we discover that techniques and technologies move, shift, change over time that may be outside of the normative way we have always looked at things. So what global architecture history does is try to sort of ask questions about these buildings that are not within these standard purviews. So Islam, when it becomes a major religious force, it borrows a lot of architecture and brings architects into it and moves architects from one place to the other place. And we see a lot of sort of, once again, technologies being transferred, ideas being transferred, forms and shapes and different techniques that are brought in by sort of Islam. Same thing by Christianity, if you will, but Christianity and Islamic engineers are borrowing and exchanging as well. So what we want to do is find these touching points and to explore them and see them as equal value as, if you will, the things that we might normally think as peripheral, as what we might sort of seeing as sort of the classical or at the center of an argument. So we can go to Durham Cathedral in England, and we discover that there are these vaults that look a lot like a mosque in Sicily. Well, that's because the Normans went down to Sicily, they conquered Sicily, they saw the mosques there, and they said, hey, you have some pretty good architects here, let's go back up to England and build something for me, but we're going to call it a cathedral. So these are the types of stories that I think global architectural history is interested in. Whereas normally these stories might be seen as sort of the strange stories. Actually, there are more of these stories than one would expect. I was trained in what's called a Eurocentric Worldview, where architectural history started in Egypt, and then it developed to Mesopotamia, and then it went to Europe and flourished in Europe. And then somewhere, God knows where in China, they were doing something, no one knows what. And then in India, they were doing something. In Africa, no one really knew what they were doing there at all. That was the classic training, and it's still in some places in the United States, this is how architects are trained. Well, about in the 70s or 80s, we realized this was obviously not right. But what's the answer to this? And we're still experimenting with finding, in some sense, a more robust answer to that. We know what's wrong, we don't know necessarily what's right, because there are many ways to do a better history than that. Initially, the argument was, well, let's go to villages, to places in Southeast Asia and discover and talk about the amazing architecture of Southeast Asian villages and look through these things as a question of shelter and culture and understand a type of more village-based as opposed to civilizational-based architecture. So you had capital A architecture, fancy buildings, and then you had little architecture, which was meant to be like alive and interesting. Well, that duality doesn't really work too well because many of these villages were making amazing buildings that you can't know how to categorize it if you just say that they're, just because they're made out of bamboo, they're sort of more primitive or not. Right? So that sort of began to be less interesting as a solution. And also the buildings that we might think as capital A architecture, like Borobudur Temple, which is one of the great masterpieces of architecture, all of a sudden we realized that it's much more interesting than we had thought as well. So that classic distinction between sort of big architecture and local architecture began to fall apart. And certainly as we became, global in a way, we realized that just as we are now traveling around and going to these places and finding them more interesting, their actual buildings themselves historically are more interesting. We can now travel to Borobudur and study it and analyze it, whereas when I was a student going to Borobudur, it would have cost a fortune. I couldn't afford it. I couldn't go there, and I didn't know even how would you go there to these places. Now it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. 500,000 people go to this site. So for us to not go there and to reanalyze these things is a real shame. But we don't know, but we still haven't yet found often the right hook to understand these buildings and how they are situated historically, because we need to do a lot more historical work. And global architectural history is a way to sort of open up our interest into architecture globally that we understand now needs to be sort of done. It'll take decades and generations, the fuel of research, to come up with better answers than what we've had 20 years ago. Just because we can travel to a place doesn't mean that we can actually understand it. It certainly helps, because if you travel to Borobudur, you can look at it and understand it through the architectural historical world as through the world of religion or the world of art or the world of sculpture. But you still need to have a drawing. You still need to have plans. And if you go to Southeast Asia, where there are hundreds and hundreds of fantastic temples with no plans, no sections, no drawings, how are you going to study them? So we need to send our architectural students there, make the drawings, make the sections, make the site plans so that we can at least have the basis for a discussion. You wouldn't dream today of talking about Chartres Cathedral without showing a section through the building and cross-section through the building, a detail of the portal, some detail up here, a foundation, whatever it is. We have all the drawings that we need, generally speaking, to get a good, solid view of what Chartres Cathedral looks like. You want to go to Borobudur, there's one very bad section, and that's sort of it, and some archaeological details. You go to Southeast Asia, there are dozens and not hundreds of buildings for which there are no sections and drawings at all. So part of the problem is to update our understanding just in terms of the building through the drawings and the analysis that goes with the drawings in terms of proportion or form, context or orientation, alignments, heights and widths of these buildings that you would just need in order to just say something. as opposed to just take a picture of it and say this was built by King somebody or other in 1220. That's completely meaningless, right? We want to say something a lot more. So here again, we're working on fumes in many of these sites. So a lot of research needs to be done in order to sort of upgrade our knowledge about these buildings. So when we think of global architectural history, the reason I'm excited about it is because we're just beginning to understand how little we know about architecture globally. We can still produce all sorts of histories that will flesh in the gaps and the problems, but ultimately we're often really working on very, very thin material. So another classic example is Lalibela in Ethiopia. 1200, they made these churches cut out of the rock, out of the top of a mountain. Just unbelievable, beautiful, complicated, sophisticated buildings. There's only one plan that's been made of this. No sections, no drawings, very little analysis. There's the local convention that these buildings were made by angels, which itself is sort of an interesting paradox about how architecture gets made in a sort of a magical way. But we as historians know it's not angels that made it, it's actually humans. But what humans made this? Well, we need to go and study it and send, teams, not of archaeologists, but of architecture students who will measure the buildings and sort of look at it in a different way. Then we can understand why in the year 1200, this is one of the greatest buildings of that era, compared with Chartres Cathedral from a similar era. We talk about Chartres, all the time. Here we compare it with a building in Africa that we might not even think about, largely because we don't have the materials. So we're still talking, I would say, 20 years, 30 years down the line before we have the resources to upgrade our information about many of these sites. But over the decades, as we get more robust material, we'll be able to tell more complicated stories, and the stories will then also be more interesting. So the global history is only just beginning in some sense. We're just projecting a desire to make these buildings more relevant in our consciousness. And the political impact of this is also not to be underestimated. We often think of ourselves living in a flat world of globalized economies and globalized productions. And we go to these places and we realize that if we understand cultures through these architectures, then actually understanding culture, their deep history becomes all the more resonant to us. And we can share this information, and this is a way to understand Ethiopian culture by understanding Lalibela, or Indonesian culture by understanding Borobudur. So in some sense, these buildings can serve as a way to talk to each other outside of the framework of just, this is me and this is you, right? Because now we're talking about how buildings are part of much more complicated sort of trade scenarios, sharing shared environments and so forth. Because I'm convinced that the churches of Lalibela, for example, were actually built by Southeast Asian engineers from India. They were trading with Africa at that time, and these buildings, which are built almost ex nihilo, were similar to buildings that you would find in India, in Ellora, and other places. So clearly the Indians must have come in not only with their trade and their spices and their pepper, but with some engineers who said, hey, I can make a great church for you, right? So the Ethiopians are the one who bought and paid for it and probably built it and so forth, but there must have been some exchange between Ethiopia and India. I'm actually convinced of it. So, but we need to prove that. It's just a conjecture. We need to sort of go out there and find these things. And that's the promise that global history can do. It can show how people have interacted for millennia. Before we think we've discovered globalization, but in reality, in smaller ways, the globe has been stitched together in very many interesting things, and architecture is often the example for that.